I'm Janine Cavender-Bears in Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, and I am delighted to introduce today's Bullard lecturer, Dr. Sarah Hobbie, who's a Regents professor at the University of Minnesota and a distinguished McKnight University professor. She's a member of the Ecological Society of America, the American Geophysical Union. I'm going to tell you a bit about a few things. She told me to keep it simple. So I will start with, she's a Minnesota native and grew up leading wilderness treks up into the boundary waters, into Canada, and culminating in the Arctic, which was a really important starting point for her career in Arctic biology, which is where she started out in her PhD. But before that, she was at Carleton. She did her undergrad at Carleton. She did her PhD at Berkeley with Terry Chapin, and she went to work with Terry so that she could work on Arctic biology. That's where she got her start, working in long-term ecological research sites, which she has spent her entire career working in and championing. She did a postdoc at Stanford with Peter Matusik. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's a highly cited researcher. So many accolades that, the list is quite long. She, for many, many years, was, and still is, playing a leadership role at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, a long-term ecological research site, and is now, I think in year 5 of leading, that she's the director and PI of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Long-Term Ecological Research Urban LTER, which she managed to get off the ground after many years of working at Cedar Creek. Very extraordinary to watch her do that. One fun link back to Cambridge is her parents met here. Her father went to MIT for undergrad and did his PhD in physics here at Harvard, and then they went back to the Midwest, where her mom's from. And I just want to say 2 more things. So I've known Sarah for over 2 decades. She's been an incredibly important role model for me and taught me things like what collaborative leadership looks like and how to keep the mission in focus, really making the whole effort about the mission. And that's been really wonderful to have learned from her all those years, and I'm so delighted to hear your talk today.
Well, thank you, Janine, for that introduction. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm really short, so I will try to be close to this microphone. I've had a really delightful day. Thank you so much for this invitation. I've had wonderful conversations, and I'm super excited to go to Harvard Forest, which I've never visited before. So this has just been a really wonderful adventure to come out here and participate as this Bullard lecturer. So I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing for quite a number of years in the Twin Cities. And then I'll kind of start to couch it in some of the more recent work that we started doing as part of the Urban LTER site. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about actually has predated the LTER. So the context for this is really that people who live in urban places get a lot of benefits from clean water. So it may be drinking water or climate regulation or aesthetic benefits, cultural benefits, food, recreational opportunities. Urban residents really value clean water. And yet a lot of our urban waters look something like this for at least part of the year. So this is an example of a lake in my neighborhood that's heavily eutrophied, a lot of algal growth in the summertime. And the reason for this poor water quality is non-point source pollution, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen. And urban areas are especially vulnerable to becoming eutrophied to experiencing this kind of pollution, and that's because of the unique urban form where we have a lot of impervious surfaces, so parking lots and roads and buildings and streets, or I guess I already said that, that rapidly convey materials downstream. And so if we think about what an urban headwater stream might look like and compare that to what we might see in a non-urbanized area, there are some pretty big differences. So here we have a non-urban headwater stream. So this is actually what we might see around here in this landscape for a headwater stream. And this is essentially what our urban headwater streams look like. So these are our city streets. And you can see that there are a lot of differences. The riparian zones look really different. There's no hyporheic zone in our urban headwater stream. In other words, there's no interaction between the water and, any part of the ground below the street. And these streets are really effective at conveying water and materials from land downstream. And because they're so effective, in order to prevent flooding, we need to have these really dense stormwater conveyances that move water rapidly off of the street so that we don't get a lot of flooding. So this is what a lot of our streams in urban areas look like. This is a creek in St. Paul, Minnesota that no longer runs above ground. So it runs through this pipe. There's an effort right now to daylight or open up some of this creek, but obviously this creek has again really different characteristics than a creek that's not in a pipe, right? So if you think about what are the biota that are living in this creek, what opportunities are there to retain nutrients or other materials as they move downstream? They're going to be really different inside of this pipe than they are in a stream that has a more natural flow. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a watershed approach that we've been taking to first understanding sources of urban nutrient pollution. Then I'm going to be talking about some management opportunities that emerged from that understanding, as well as some challenges. And then I'll touch a little on some of the new directions that we're headed as part of the urban LTER. So as I mentioned previously, the work that I'm going to talk about, a lot of it predates our new urban LTER project, but I wanted to give you a little bit of the context for the urban LTER program because I'm going to touch on it throughout the talk, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about fits within this framework. So I know that a lot of you, a bit sadly, are familiar with the LTER program, but for those of you who aren't, this is a network of sites that are funded by the National Science Foundation, and I just left Harvard Forest on there. There are a number of sites ranging from the Arctic all the way to Antarctica, and these sites are funded on a 6-year cycle. And currently there are 2 urban LTER sites, so I've shown those in red. The CAP LTER Central Arizona Phoenix has been around since the mid-90s. We are the newest site in the network. As Janine mentioned, we're in our 5th year of funding. So this is our study site. We actually work all around the Twin Cities metro. So we're working in the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area. There are over 100 municipalities. So we think of it as the Twin Cities, but it's many more municipalities than just the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. The total population is about 3 million. And just to orient you, because I'm going to show a lot of kind of images like this, and so that you're oriented to the metro, we sit at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. So I'm always going to indicate on the maps that I show where downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul are, just so that you can be oriented when I put up different maps. So importantly, as I said, we sit at the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers. This place is sacred to the Dakota people. It represents their origin place, and they call this place Bedote. One of the things that we are trying to do in our work is be mindful of the fact that where we are working is not only the historical lands of the Dakota people, but also the present day lands and the cultural lands of the Dakota people. And there are Dakota sacred sites throughout the place that we are working. And so we have tried to make space for engaging with indigenous communities especially, and I'm happy to talk about sort of how that's been going and what we've been doing. But this will kind of come up a little bit more at the end of my talk. So the goal of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Urban LTER is to illuminate relationships between urban nature and people, both towards understanding how urban ecosystems respond to rapid environmental and social change, but also hopefully to inform solutions, especially solutions that address some of the inequities that we see in terms of who benefits and who is burdened by urban nature. And we're working across scales, both in the natural system, from organisms on up to landscapes, and also in the social system, from individuals on up to the whole metro region. We organize ourselves around 4 major questions. The first set of questions have to do with understanding interactions between land use and management, climate change, biodiversity, and urban stressors on terrestrial systems. We're also asking a similar set of questions in aquatic systems. We're also asking questions about decision-making and how those decisions influence environmental inequities, both in the past and thinking about going forward. And we've also been trying to understand the process of doing inclusive community-engaged research and how that influences scientific and community outcomes. Mostly today, I'm going to be talking about work that really touches on the interaction between land use and management in influencing aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so just to orient you, how many of you think about stormwater on a daily basis? Okay, actually quite a number of you. So there's probably a number of you that don't think about stormwater that much. So just to orient you to thinking about stormwater, I just want to explain or remind you of some key features of stormwater and surface waters in the Twin Cities Metro. And most of these, I think, apply to Cambridge as well, except for maybe this first one. So in the Twin Cities, we have separated sanitary and storm sewers. I know that in Cambridge, from my reading, it looks like you're in the process of separating sanitary and storm sewers. So you still have some combined sewers and combined sewer overflows. And so what that means is that sewage is treated centrally in the Twin Cities, but stormwater is not treated centrally. And that means then that non-point nutrient pollution is really important, an important cause of stormwater pollution. And we also, just like you here, we have 2 iconic rivers, we have abundant surface water, and clean water is highly valued. It's a bipartisan issue. People really care about water in the Twin Cities. And if you've ever flown into the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, you probably, if you looked out the window, there's a lot of water in the Twin Cities. And so it's important to understand, how we can manage this water to improve water quality, because a lot of it looks like this, at least during some parts of the summer. So this is getting a little more quantitative about this. This is just the most recently published impaired waters list from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So in the metro region, we have over 1,000 lakes. They have not all been assessed for impairment, but of the lakes that have been assessed, about half of them are impaired considered impaired by one or more stressor. And the most important stressors in the metro region are related either to excess nutrient loading or to chloride. I'm not going to talk about chloride today, but if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it after the talk. We do have a student who's working on it right now and have done some work on chloride in the past. So first of all, to talk about this work that we've done, taking a watershed approach to understanding urban nutrient pollution. So in this work, what we've done is basically borrowed the small watershed approach that was really, pioneered in the White Mountains of New Hampshire at the Hubbard Brook LTER. And the idea is that, if you can understand the water and the materials coming into this watershed, and you compare that to what's being exported at the bottom of the watershed, you can learn something about what's going on within the watershed. So you can learn something about the functioning of that watershed. And so if we're thinking about urban storm sewer sheds, urban watersheds that all drain through a storm drain network, their functioning and their characteristics are really different from a non-urban watershed. So these are my cartoons of a non-urban watershed and an urban storm sewer shed. And in a non-urban watershed, if we're trying to understand, say, nutrient export to some downstream water body, whether that be a lake or a coast, then what we might do in this small watershed approach is quantify the inputs of nutrients to that watershed. And by comparing the inputs and outputs, we might learn something about the cycling, the processing that's happening within the watershed. And in a non-urban watershed, there are opportunities for elements, for nutrients to interact with soils. They're going to be moved into headwater streams. There's going to be further opportunities for those nutrients to potentially be retained as they move downstream. There might be wetlands that those nutrients, move through and might be, emitted from or retained. But in a non-urban watershed, first of all, we likely have, high levels of nutrients coming into that watershed, but also the drainage network reaches high up into the watershed. There's very little opportunity then for water, for elements to interact with soils, to interact with vegetation as it moves from land into that drainage network. And then, in many cases, we've filled in the wetlands. Those pipes are bypassing opportunities for those nutrients to, interact with the landscape. And so that they can move, pretty rapidly downstream without any sort of, transformation. And so we've essentially been applying this small watershed approach to urban storm sewer sheds, where we have quantified the outputs at the bottom of the watershed, and so this is usually in a storm drain, and then compared that to the inputs to these watersheds. And we've been focusing primarily on phosphorus and nitrogen. So the work that I'm going to describe has mostly been done to subwatersheds of the Mississippi in the city of St. Paul. Some of them extend a little bit north of St. Paul, but essentially they're in St. Paul. So if we zoom in, here we have the bend in the river and downtown St. Paul. And all these colored blobs represent a sub-watershed or sub-storm sewer shed of the Mississippi River that has a monitoring station at the bottom of the storm sewer shed that's been monitored by our partner in this work, the Capital Region Watershed District. And so they've been measuring basically export of nutrients out of these storm sewer sheds. And so then we were able to come along and measure and estimate the inputs of nutrients to these watersheds and then compare inputs and outputs. So these are what these watersheds look like. They're highly residential. There's a little bit of commercial industrial, and then this one of them includes the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus, which has an ag experiment station on it. Okay, so first of all, we wanted to ask, what are the sources of nutrients to these urban watersheds? Then we wanted to compare the sources of nutrients, the inputs of nutrients to these watersheds to the outputs, and ask, are nutrients retained or exported? And if they're exported, what are the major pathways by which they're being exported? So we'll start with these sources of nutrients. We used a variety of approaches to estimate nutrient inputs to these watersheds. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if you have questions about it, I can tell you. We had done some household surveys that we scaled up to the watershed scale on things like pet ownership, how many pets, how big are the pets, and you'll see that that becomes important. Also, we asked questions about fertilizer use, yard waste management practices. We also used models and some field work to come up with these input estimates. So this set of figures shows what we found for these watershed nutrient inputs, with nitrogen on the left and phosphorus on the right. And I've just organized these sub-watersheds from the most residential to the least residential. And so here we have inputs in kilograms per kilometer squared per year. And if you look at nitrogen, you can see that by far and away the biggest input to these watersheds is residential fertilizer, followed by atmospheric deposition and also household pet waste. So I want to just pause and just remind you that because we have separated sanitary and storm sewer systems, that means that all of the nutrients that are coming into the watershed that are consumed by people bypass the storm drainage network and go down through the sanitary sewer system to this big pig's eye wastewater treatment plant, which is downstream of what I'm talking about. So we aren't considering human food and human waste as an input to these watersheds because of that. However, pets, some fraction of the nitrogen and phosphorus that's consumed by cats and dogs ends up in the landscape. And we used information on, pet nutritional needs and used that to estimate how much nitrogen and phosphorus a certain size dog would be consuming, for example, in a year, and then used literature values or literature information about pet waste pickup practices to estimate how much pet waste was ending up in the landscape. Obviously, all of the urine ends up in the landscape, but only some fraction of the feces. Okay, so residential fertilizer, most important nitrogen input. If we look at phosphorus, you'll see that we don't have a bar for residential fertilizer, and that's because Minnesota has a restriction on phosphorus use in residential fertilizer and lawn fertilizer. There's a little bit of phosphorus in fertilizer that's used by golf courses, by institution campuses, so the bar is small enough that you can't see it in this figure. So that means that the most important phosphorus input to these landscapes or to these watersheds is actually pet waste, followed by deposition. Okay, so we wanted to know, what fraction of these inputs are retained in these watersheds. And so but before we do that, I just wanted to show you, because this is kind of interesting, that we also found that from our survey work that households contribute really disproportionately to fertilizer end use. So this is just looking at the percentage of total households that contribute to the total flux and of nitrogen into these watersheds. And we found that, about 20% of households are responsible for about 70% of the fertilizer coming into these watersheds. 30% of the top 20% are using a lawn care company, and 84% of the most frequent fertilizers are using a lawn care company. So, and some people are not using fertilizer at all. And we see a similar situation with pets, and this is essentially that, you have a small fraction of households that have like a couple big dogs that are responsible for the majority of the pet waste phosphorus that's coming into these watersheds. Okay, so then in order to understand if these nutrients are retained or exported, we have to compare them to what's being exported from these watersheds. And so we were able to get good information on stormwater export from the Capital Region Watershed District, but then we also estimated other ways that nutrients are exported from these watersheds through our survey work primarily, and also, through our survey work. So here we have nitrogen again on the left, phosphorus on the right. And you can see that the majority of the export of both nitrogen and phosphorus is happening through stormwater, storm drain export. But there's also some removal of nutrients through yard waste management. So people are, either taking grass clippings out of the watershed or leaf litter, and that's happening primarily because they're taking them to these transfer stations that the city runs, and then those are being taken out to these commercial composting facilities, which are outside of these watersheds. And so we had to account for that removal when we were comparing inputs to storm drain export. And so I'm just going to show you phosphorus today. So here we're looking at net inputs of phosphorus to the watershed. So this is now the total inputs minus that yard waste removal, and comparing that to storm drain export. And so the dashed line is the one-to-one line. So you can see that each of these dots represents a different watershed. On average, we're getting about 22% of phosphorus. That should be like 88% retention. I never noticed that typo before. Okay, so most of the phosphorus is being retained in these watersheds. So there's a close to the one-to-one line. So these watersheds, I'm sorry, I'm just saying this opposite. There's very little retention, so most of the inputs are being exported. And so these watersheds are super leaky for phosphorus, which is the opposite of what we usually think in watersheds. We usually think of phosphorus as being really retained and not easily exported because it interacts a lot with soil particles. So we're getting a lot of export of phosphorus from these watersheds. And so we wanted to know, why are watersheds so leaky for phosphorus? What are the ways that phosphorus is being exported from these watersheds? So that was the next question that we set about to ask. And again, I want to kind of remind you of the structure of these urban headwater streams. There just aren't a lot of mechanisms for retaining material in the riparian zone or in the street. Once it's in the street, it's eventually going to be moved downstream. And then as it moves downstream into these storm drainage networks, unless there's a stormwater pond or a rain garden or something, there aren't mechanisms to keep those materials, to retain those materials before they get downstream to the water body that we care about. So there are a few different ways that we were thinking about how phosphorus might move into streets. And so one is through leaf litter fall of trees that are growing adjacent to streets. So trees take up nutrients from the soil. They invest those nutrients into leaves. In the fall, around, in the temperate zone, right now, trees are starting to retranslocate nitrogen and phosphorus from their leaves, but they only retranslocate about 50% of the nutrients in their leaves before they drop. And so trees that are growing adjacent to streets essentially act like little nutrient pumps. They're moving nutrients from the soil, and some fraction of those are ending up in the street. So unless those leaves or that material, that litter fall is picked up, that material is going to either in particulate form or in dissolved form is eventually going to make its way into the storm drain. And the phosphorus in leaves is really bioavailable. So as that material decomposes, that phosphorus will be released in forms that can be used by aquatic organisms. You can also, of course, get runoff of nutrients, so overland flow, and runoff of dissolved and particulate nutrients into the street through that pathway. And so and just to remind you, tree litter falls into the street throughout the growing season. So in the spring, we see a lot of flowers and bracts coming into the street. In the summer, we see, seeds. So these are a bunch of like aborted samaras that have fallen into the street. And then, of course, in the autumn, we see a lot of leaf litter coming into the street. But there's material coming into the street throughout the season. So we are starting to get more and more evidence that trees are an important source of nutrient pollution to stormwater. So I'm just going to show you a few different lines of evidence. So this is comparing canopy cover over streets to stormwater, phosphorus, and nitrogen concentration. So this is work that Jacques Finlay and Ben Jenke have done, where they basically pulled together data from 90 watersheds throughout the metro. So each of these points represents a watershed. And then they looked at the average canopy cover over the streets in that watershed and compared that to the concentration of phosphorus in stormwater and nitrogen. So for phosphorus, you can see there's a positive relationship for total phosphorus, which includes dissolved and particulate forms, but also for total dissolved phosphorus, and which includes dissolved organic phosphorus and then soluble reactive phosphorus. For nitrogen, the relationship seems like it's stronger for total organic nitrogen, not for inorganic nitrogen, and maybe it's saturating for total nitrogen. But across all of these watersheds, we see this pretty clear relationship between canopy cover over the street and stormwater phosphorus concentrations. Then we did a study. This is a former graduate student, Erin Mittag, who was able to compare what was being exported in stormwater with how much phosphorus was being exported in stormwater with how much phosphorus was coming in litter fall into the streets in that watershed. So again, in this graph, we have percent tree canopy cover over the street versus either litter fall, which is the green dots, phosphorus inputs to streets, or stormwater phosphorus export in the black. And so these are basically paired, where each of these dots represents a watershed, a single watershed, and there's a value for litter fall phosphorus into the street and a value for stormwater phosphorus export. And the way that we estimated litter fall phosphorus into streets was basically choosing watersheds where we had collected street sweepings on a really frequent basis, like where the sweeping was frequent enough that we are essentially using the street as a litter basket. So if you've ever done work in a forest, hopefully a lot of you have, because this is a talk associated with Harvard Forest, we were essentially using the street as a litter basket to estimate annual litter fall inputs. And then we could calculate the amount of phosphorus in that litter fall and compare it to stormwater phosphorus export. And so on average, we were estimating that about 57% of the watershed phosphorus export was coming from litter fall phosphorus. And then the last bit of evidence that I'll give you comes not from work that we did, but from work that Bill Selbig, who's at the USGS in Middleton, Wisconsin, did. We wanted to do this study, but we had trouble getting funding to do it. So Bill set up these little neighborhood watersheds. Basically, he identified, a part of a neighborhood that was all draining to a single storm drain, and he had a test catchment that he would sweep on a weekly basis during the snow-free season, and then a control catchment without sweeping. And he did that for a year. These are neighborhoods that have 40% canopy cover in Madison. And this is what he found. If you look at the treated watershed, especially the green bar, which is the autumn period, you can see that there was a really big reduction in the total phosphorus coming out of this little catchment in the treated catchment compared to the control. But there was also a reduction at other times of the year as well. So a fair amount of evidence then that trees can contribute significant nutrients to streets and stormwater in their litter fall. We also have evidence that runoff during particular times of the year is also an important way that that phosphorus is exported from streets. And so especially during extreme rain events, we're getting, just like you are here, we're getting a lot more extreme rain events in the early summer in the Twin Cities. And so we get these really heavy rainfall events. And this is just an example, like actually looking out the window of my house and then our neighbors next door, where we had, one of these really drenching rainfalls, and the water is flowing, sort of from the backyards, between the houses, over the sidewalk and into the street. And so there's just a lot of opportunity for leaching and movement of particulates during these extreme rain events. And so this is looking at a small residential watershed now at the cumulative phosphorus exported from this watershed in dry years and also in wet years. And you can just see that there's just a lot more phosphorus that gets exported during these wet years. And you can see that sort of step-like, pattern where you're getting a lot of phosphorus coming off in single heavy rain events. The other time that we think is important for phosphorus export is during snowmelt. And so this is some work that a former student, Anika Bratt, did. So here we're looking at cumulative phosphorus and nitrogen export from this same watershed, actually, that I was just showing you over the course of 2 years, getting really detailed information, especially during the winter time, which often isn't measured as carefully. And so what she found was that, upwards of half of the phosphorus being exported, and the same is true for nitrogen, was happening very rapidly during the snowmelt period. We don't know exactly where that phosphorus is coming from. It could be material that didn't get swept up the previous fall. It could be phosphorus that accumulated in the snowpack over the winter. It could be leaching that's happening sort of in the surface, thatch over lawns as things melt out. But clearly an important time for phosphorus export from these watersheds. Okay, so to conclude so far, what we found is that urban watersheds are really effective at exporting phosphorus to stormwater, that litter fall and runoff during intense rain and snowmelt events move substantial nutrients into storm drains. So now I want to talk a little bit about some management opportunities and challenges. But first I want to pause because so far I've basically been telling you that trees are bad, and this lecture is supposed to be about forests. And so I want to acknowledge that trees in cities have benefits as well. And they have cooling benefits, they have wildlife benefits, cultural, aesthetic benefits. And some of the work in the MSPLTR has actually been showing how historical legacies of racist lending policies have given rise to an uneven distribution of those benefits in the present day. So I wanted to just highlight some work that's being done by folks in the LTER who are interested in how decision-making, both in the past and present, lead to environmental inequities. So just a brief shout out to this work that has been done by Rebecca Walker and Hannah Raymer, where they've been looking at this coupling of nature, wealth, and race. So these maps are all maps of the city of Minneapolis, and they show the percent non-Hispanic white population, so race, they show temperature, they show parkland, and tree cover. And you'll see that there's a correspondence where basically the people of color are living in places with higher temperatures, lower tree cover, and lower parkland. And this has been seen in a lot of cities. I think what Rebecca and Hannah's contribution was that they showed that this was tied to the presence of racial covenants. And so each of the little, they're a bit hard to see in this graph, but each of the little black dots represents a parcel that had a racial covenant where basically this parcel, the deed said you cannot sell to a person of color, essentially. And the developers who developed these neighborhoods actually, so this was work that Rebecca and Hannah did, they showed that these developers had worked really closely with the park board to say, hey, I'm gonna improve your park, which will increase my property values. And I'm also going to include these racial covenants in these properties where we're doing these park improvements. So you can still see the legacies of these arrangements that occurred between the developers and the park board on the landscape today in terms of who's benefiting from the cooling effects of trees. Okay. All right, so if we're thinking about trying to manage urban water quality, the traditional approach has been to focus on end-of-the-pipe stormwater management. So let's try to capture the water before it goes into the water body that we care about, either and remove the phosphorus in some way. So if we put in a stormwater pond, for example, if we can divert the water into a stormwater pond, maybe we can retain some of that phosphorus, or perhaps do some kind of treatment of the lake itself. But it's also possible to, try to target the sources of nutrients in the first place that before they get into the storm drainage network. So this is an example of some end-of-the-pipe stormwater management where basically the water is captured and allowed to infiltrate before it moves downstream. This is, a stormwater pond. This is a below-ground infiltration area. These can be really expensive to install, and they also, there's also not a lot of space in urban areas to implement some of these practices. This is another example of an end-of-the-pipe stormwater management treatment. So this has gotten really popular in the Twin Cities. There are like over 100 lakes that have done this now, and it's expensive. Basically, they dump a whole bunch of aluminum sulfate into the lake. It binds up the phosphorus, and it's quite effective. So this is a graduate student, Katie Pollock, and she's been trying to understand actually the biogeochemistry in these lakes. Once you bind up the phosphorus, how is that affecting nitrogen cycling, for example? So these end-of-the-pipe solutions tend to be quite expensive. There's also possibilities for doing source control. So one option is to control new inputs. So in Minnesota, we've already tried to do that with phosphorus, right? We have a restriction on phosphorus use in lawn fertilizer. Another mechanism is to install rain gardens high up in the watershed so that you're basically, creating more opportunities for water to soak into the ground, and you can, potentially get capture of particulates and infiltration that, allows you to bind up nutrients before they move downstream. And then the practice that I'm going to actually talk about a bit more is street sweeping, where essentially you're trying to reduce that land water nutrient flow. Okay, so we've done a couple different projects partnering with cities to try to understand the efficacy of using street sweeping as a way of controlling or preventing nutrient pollution downstream. And so we've partnered with cities to measure the amount of nutrients that they capture in their street sweeping programs to try to understand the sources of variation in that. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just to point out that, we do see that we get more phosphorus in more total materials and more phosphorus in areas that have higher canopy cover, and also during the autumn months. So just what you would expect, although there's a lot of variation that we still don't understand from, each of these dots or points represents a different street sweeping route. But we do see that the total phosphorus that we recover in sweepings is highest in the fall, where the canopy cover is high. And if we look at the contribution of leaf litter to the swept materials, you can see that, in the fall, we see the highest percentage of phosphorus in the swept materials coming from litter fall. So we have a fair amount of evidence that we've amassed that suggests that, a lot of the stuff that sweepers are getting, especially in the fall in high canopy neighborhoods, is leaf litter fall. And we've also done some estimates of the cost effectiveness of removing phosphorus with street sweeping. So this is just showing a couple of examples of different street sweeping routes. And so the dark blue is a high canopy street sweeping route, and the dashed light blue is a low canopy street sweeping route. And we calculated the cost per pound, because that's how public works folks think, of removing phosphorus for these two routes. And we did this actually for a bunch of routes, but I'm just showing you a couple examples. And the important takeaway message here is that when the sweeping is done in a high canopy route, at the times of year when there's the most litter fall, the cost is down, below $100 per pound of phosphorus removed. And that is like at least one order of magnitude cheaper than removing phosphorus through some of these more conventional structural stormwater control measures that I showed you, and certainly alum treatment. So we think that if you sweep in the right place more frequently in the fall, that can be actually a pretty cost-effective way of keeping phosphorus out of the storm drainage network. But there are some challenges with street sweeping as a management tool. So the advantages are that it's effective for nitrogen and phosphorus removal. It can be cost effective if it's targeted appropriately, so done at the right time in the right place. Some challenges, it's hard to time relative to phenology. So, I've just noticed around here, the phenology is pretty similar to what I see in Minnesota. Like the ash trees are just starting, the red maples are just starting. But, then we have oaks that are holding on to their leaves all winter. So that can be a real challenge to figure out the timing, the appropriate timing for street sweeping. It's inconvenient for residents. I noticed when I was poking around online, there's been all sorts of things in Cambridge where first they were like gonna fine people, and then they weren't going to or ticket people, and then they tried not to ticket people, and I think they ticket again if you have your car out when the sweepers are supposed to go by. It requires capital investment in the sweepers, and importantly for us, like when we talk to public works folks, there has been a lack of a state certified credit for street sweeping. And I think this is actually true pretty much countrywide. So just to give you a really dumbed down kind of version of US stormwater pollution regulation, it's a federal program that's implemented by states and cities for the most part. And it's designed to reduce pollution entering our water bodies. But importantly, it requires cities that have a separated sewer to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, and this is called an MS4, if you are familiar with that. But only certain actions receive pollution reduction credit in these plans. And so street sweeping historically has not received credit. And so there hasn't been any incentive for cities to basically use street sweeping as a management strategy. And so we have been working and have worked with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to basically develop a street sweeping pollution reduction credit. And I want to give a lot of credit, no pun intended, to this gentleman, Mike Trojan, who's now retired, but he was at the MPCA for a long time. And we'd been talking to folks at the MPCA for a long time about our work and saying, hey, we really think that litter falls an important contribution to stormwater pollution, and we think street sweeping at the right time in the right place is really cost effective. And we weren't really getting any interest, but Mike moved into this position and was really interested in trying to work on this. And so it just kind of, I don't know, highlights the role of individuals, I think, in moving things forward. So now we do have a credit in place. And we've been working with Extension to kind of roll this out and inform Public Works departments throughout the state about this credit. And I will just mention that like New Hampshire now is modeling a crediting program after the Minnesota credit. So we've been in conversations with folks at UNH about this as well. And I did want to give Cambridge some credit. So they seem to be really promoting like individual action around keeping leaves out of the streets. And I'm happy to kind of talk about that whole approach later if you want. All right, so then just to conclude this part of the talk, we've found that street sweeping, at the right time and in the right place is a cost-effective way of managing nutrient pollution. And adoption of street sweeping as a management strategy really required regulation changes and engagement with managers. So I just want to touch really briefly on some new directions that we're taking in this water quality space. And that is thinking about the role of inclusive community engaged research in affecting our scientific direction. And so I want to kind of go back to this topic of engaging with Indigenous partners. So this is a woman who directs an Indigenous nonprofit, a Dakota-led nonprofit that is managing some Dakota sacred sites throughout St. Paul, some really abused sites. So this is a site that is a Dakota sacred site, but it also used to be a rail yard. It was a dump. And they were really concerned that they had people harvesting for food and medicine in this place that they weren't sure was a healthy place to be harvesting. So they actually, serendipitously, we got connected with them and they asked us to just do some analyses for them and find out, what kinds of heavy metals and things were in these plants. And so this actually led us to kind of a whole new area of research. So this is work that my colleague Emily Snellroot and her postdoc Tim Mitchell did looking at levels of lead in soil in St. Paul parks. And you can see that there are some parks that have quite concerning soil lead concentrations, so like above EPA's residential screening level. And if you look at a map of those, you can see they're kind of clustered pretty close to downtown. Then, the water folks on the MSP LTER team said, well, let's look at what's going on in stormwater. We pay all this attention to nitrogen and phosphorus, but what about lead? And so these are concentrations of lead in stormwater runoff in a bunch of subwatersheds of the Mississippi. And again, we see this area kind of, pretty close to downtown really lighting up for lead in stormwater. And then Natalia Mosman-Cook, who is a postdoc with Daniel Stanton, kind of learned about this, and she said, well, I do this work on lichens, and we can actually use lichens as inexpensive air quality monitors. And so she put out a whole bunch of lichens that she got actually from Cedar Creek. So they were, relatively clean lichens, and put them out throughout the metro. And these are the lead concentrations that she measured in these lichens after 10 months. And so you can see again that we sort of see this area with high lead concentrations that seems to be coinciding between the air, the water, and the soil. And so this is St. Paul. And what we think is probably going on is that this area is in the flight path of the downtown St. Paul airport, and small aircraft still use this aviation gas, which is leaded. And so, people are aware of this, and there's talk about, maybe this should be regulated. If you go on the EPA's website, back in 2023, they were talking about it. They haven't been really talking about it since then. But we think that this may be contributing to these high lead concentrations in this area. Okay, so I'm done. I know I'm probably over time here. But, my overall conclusions are that, taking a watershed approach to understanding urban water quality has led us to new insights and new solutions. But that also engaging with these community partners has led us to novel research directions and discoveries. So I just want to acknowledge lots and lots of funding and partners and collaborators, and happy to take any questions. Yeah.
We're surprised by the role of the pets, but I guess it's hard to follow all the numbers. I guess it's much less than the role of trees, for example.
Yeah, so I have to make this distinction that the pets are, so there's a difference between like the nutrients that are coming into the watershed and then the nutrients that are getting transported within the watershed. So the pets are a mechanism because we buy pet food that was produced outside of the watershed and we feed it to our pets and then it ends up in the watershed. They're a mechanism that brings phosphorus into the watershed, but the trees are basically a mechanism by which phosphorus that's already in the watershed is getting moved around. Is that? Yeah, okay.
Another question I had was, is there variation among trees? So you could give advice about that? Maybe
Yeah, like in terms of their nutrient concentrations?
or when they shed.
Yeah, so yes. So we did some work where we compared like this. I'll try not to be too long-winded. Like after St. Paul got decimated by the Dutch elm disease, they thought we need to plant more diversity of trees. So what they did was they planted it by block. So you had like an ash block and a linden block. And so now like the people with the ash blocks, like they're like, oh, it sucks to be us because all the ash trees are succumbing to emerald ash borer. But it made a nice opportunity for us to compare. So I had a student actually who did that, like he swept up material from each of these blocks, and there's some variation in phosphorus concentrations, but it's really just the total amount of litter fall that kind of overwhelms that signal, which is going to depend on like how big the trees are, what stage the stand is at, sort of. And then, timing. Yeah, so that is like a real challenge because so then ideally for disease resistance, you want to plant a diversity of species on every street. But then if those species are dropping their leaves at different times, it means from a stormwater management perspective that you have to be sweeping more frequently, which costs money, right? I mean, fuel is and labor are the big costs. But I think we do know, so I mean, in an ideal world, maybe, you would plant trees that have similar phenologies, but I think we're not quite there yet. There's not enough dialogue happening between like the forestry department and the street sweeping folks. But it is a challenge because there's like a couple months over which trees are dropping their leaves. And I can't tell you the number of times that like in our neighborhood, the sweeper has come through and then the next day all the leaves drop, it happens a lot, which I think is actually a big reason why we get that pulse of phosphorus coming off in the spring. I think you in the back.
Two questions. Urban rainwater street picture that you showed many floating aquatic plants like algae or something else. So whenever if there is decrease in phosphorus content, did those floating plants disappear?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of a fascinating story. So we have a lake. That lake, actually, that I showed you was recently treated with alum. About 5 years ago, it was treated with alum. And so the alum binds up the phosphorus, and there's been a big reduction in the phytoplankton in that lake. So once the phytoplankton were gone, all of a sudden there was a lot more light that was reaching the benthos. And so then we have a lot of aquatic macrophytes that have grown up because of that, the increased light availability. And so like one interesting thing is like, what do like the residents prefer? Do they prefer, the phytoplankton, or do they prefer the aquatic macrophytes? And so we actually have some chatbot survey out by the lake that we're getting information about that from. But now this year, like for the first time, the aquatic macrophytes grew up to the surface of the lake, and then there's a filamentous algae that's growing on the surface, like attached to the aquatic macrophytes. So now we have no more phytoplankton, but we're getting this filamentous algae in this particular lake. So I think people are still learning sort of what is going to happen to these lakes, once you like treat with alum and drive down the phosphorus concentrations. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
So when you sweep,
Yeah. I hope you're going to.
certainly throw a lot of fine particulates into the air.
Oh.
And it's right where people are living and breathing.
Yeah, so they do wet down. Do they do that here? They wet it down to try to prevent so much suspension of that fine particulate matter. But I don't know of studies that have measured that. But they do try to reduce that by wetting things down.
And more generally, just you've taken a bunch of
This is the question I think that, yeah, I think
you've
you
taken a bunch
asked.
of nutrients
Yeah.
from the soil.
Yeah.
You put them up the tree, drop them down, so the soil no longer has it.
Yeah, yeah.
Where do the sweepings
Yeah,
go?
yeah. So this is a
Where
great
do those
question.
nutrients get back?
Yeah, yeah. So this is an awesome question, and we're starting to work on this a little bit. So all this material goes to this like commercial composting site north of the Twin Cities, and then some of that material gets redistributed back to municipalities so that residents can go and like pick it up and use it in their yard. And so ideally, that's what would happen. Like you would have a circular economy, or residents would do that themselves. Like they would just take the stuff out of the street and compost it in their backyard, and then use it to fertilize their lawn. But there's all sorts of questions now that have come up. Like so, when we started working with these cities, they said, "Don't ask us what we do with our sweat material because we don't want the pollution control agency to like tell us that we can't be doing that." And some are using it as fill, some are composting it, and so one of the big questions is like, how clean is it? Are there like heavy metals and hydrocarbons and things in this stuff that would mean that you wouldn't want to use it for like compost? And so one of our collaborators at the Pollution Control Agency now is trying to start assessing that. And I have a feeling that it's going to depend a lot on the time of year. I think in the fall, there's so much leaf material that probably there's not a lot of, stuff getting picked up from the road that's contaminating that material. But if you had heavy metals in your soil, that then get moving into the leaves, so we don't really know yet how safe, I guess, that material is to return to the landscape. But that would be the ideal situation, is if you could just like have a circular phosphorus economy and you wouldn't have to fertilize. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.